The storage room shouldn't have been locked from the inside. That was the first thing that stopped me. I was doing my standard pre-cold season walk of the eastern modules at Ketharoville Agricultural Station, ran on a skeleton crew by that point. 9 of us, including the 2 agronomists who kept entirely to their own building and barely acknowledged that the rest of us existed, and I came around the corner of Module 6, the one we used for off-season transit storage and seed stock overflow and nothing much else, and the indicator light on the door panel was amber. Not red, not green. Amber, which meant the internal manual latch was engaged from within. There was no one assigned to that room. I stood in the corridor and went through the reasonable explanations. A latch malfunction, but that model read red on failure, not amber. One of the agronomist assistants doing something unlogged possible, but they had no reason to use Module 6. An atmospheric compensator drift sealing the door tight, mechanically possible in a narrow range of conditions and unlikely in these ones. I went through all of it. None of it held. I knocked. Nothing. I knocked again, harder, and said through the panel that I was the station groundskeeper and that whoever was inside needed to identify themselves. Station protocol. It felt a little formal for a transit storage room on a fringe agricultural station with a 9-person roster, but station protocol existed for reasons, and I had been a groundskeeper long enough to know the reasons were usually right even when they seemed excessive. A sound came back, small, not words, something between a breath and a syllable, which was enough for me to pull the override key from my belt. The room was cold, not dangerous. The module's baseline atmospheric held, but the heating element on the eastern wall had been dialed to its lowest setting, and the space had the particular chill of somewhere that had been sitting quiet for a while. Stacked seed crates along the left wall, a transit rack with 3 empty frames, a fold-down shelf along the back, and the faint recycled air smell all the eastern modules had in the cold run-up. On the shelf in the corner where 2 walls met sat a child. She was small. Velthorin, I could tell from the coloring, pale blue-silver skin with a faint luminescence at the temples, large eyes that caught the overhead light and held it, pointed ears just visible under dark hair that had grown unevenly and fallen across her forehead. She was wearing a transit garment, the flat folding kind designed for short journeys and not any sustained stay, and it was 2 sizes too large on her. Her knees were pulled to her chest, both arms wrapped around them. She watched me the way a creature watches something it has decided is probably not an immediate threat, but has not yet confirmed. On the shelf beside her sat a data chip in a sealed case, compact diplomatic grade, the kind of seal that requires a specific biomatched authentication to open, not the kind of thing that belongs on a shelf in Module 6 of a fringe agricultural station with 9 staff and a hydroponics bay that argued with itself every second Tuesday. I looked at the chip, I looked at the child. She hadn't moved. I crouched down to her level, which put my knees on the cold floor, and said hello. She said nothing. I asked her name, nothing to that either. Her eyes moved to the chip and back to me, and I had the clear sense that she was gauging whether I was the kind of person who would reach for the chip before attending to her. I didn't reach for it. I said, "The floor's cold and you've been in here a while. There's a common room with a working heater 3 modules over. Do you want to come with me and get warm?" She studied me, really studied me, the way I had watched some of the Velthorin resettlement families assess a new space when they first arrived, taking a full inventory before committing to anything. Then she uncurled from the corner of the shelf and dropped to the floor. She picked up the chip case herself, held it against her chest with both hands, and looked at me. I took that as a yes. We walked to the common room. I made 2 cups of the grain-based hot drink that passed for tea on Ketharoville, which was not an elegant beverage, but it was warm, and I put one in front of her and sat across the table and let her decide what to do next. She wrapped both hands around the cup. She didn't drink immediately. She looked around the common room, the worn furniture, the view panel showing the gray-brown fields in the pre-cold season light, the station equipment board on the far wall, and then looked back at me. I asked again, gently, if she could tell me her name. She said a word, just one. My Velthorin was limited to about 40 practical terms from the station's resettlement support work, but the word sounded like sail, with the soft middle consonant that Velthorin uses for something that belongs or is settled, and I noted it. She drank her tea. I drank mine. The heating element in the wall ticked and settled. After a while I said, "You can stay here tonight. I'll put together a room for you in the morning." She didn't answer, but she didn't leave either. I left the chip on the table between us and didn't touch it. She watched me not touch it. Something in her posture changed, small, barely perceptible, but real. She looked at the view panel, at the gray fields and the low sky, and I thought I saw something in her face that wasn't quite relief, but was in the same neighborhood. I made up the spare room in the staff quarters corridor. Small. A cot, a storage cabinet, a narrow window that looked out at the eastern access road and the ridgeline beyond. I put extra blankets on the cot because the cold season was coming and the station heating had its gaps, showed her the facilities down the hall, told her where my room was if she needed anything in the night, and left her to it. I went back to my own room, sat at my desk, and thought about what I was going to do. The chip was the obvious thing. It was sealed, which meant whoever placed it there had intended it for a specific recipient, apparently not me, or at least not yet. The child had held it against her chest through the walk from Module 6 to the common room, and had watched me carefully enough that her trust, whatever small amount of it existed, was partly contingent on whether I would open it without permission. I wasn't going to open it without permission. I also wasn't going to contact the compact administrative office at Veth Coral and report an unaccompanied minor until I had a better sense of what I was dealing with. The administrative machinery of the compact on the outer fringe moved at its own pace and in its own directions, and I had spent enough years in resettlement support work to know that an unaccompanied child logged into the system without context could sit in processing limbo for months while the appropriate designation was argued over in offices that would never meet her. She was warm. She was fed. She was not in immediate danger. The reporting could wait 24 hours. I thought for most of that night. In the morning, she was in the common room when I came to make breakfast. She had found the view panel controls and changed the display to the station's exterior camera feed, the full sweep of the agricultural fields and the ridgeline beyond. She was sitting cross-legged on the bench, watching the light come up over the ridge. She didn't turn around when I came in, but she said the word again, sail, quietly, as though she was naming something she saw out there in the early light, something the view confirmed. I made breakfast. I put a plate in front of her. She ate without being asked. I decided she was staying, at least until I understood what the chip was and what it meant, and I started thinking practically about what a child needed that a cold fringe station could reasonably provide. The answer was not much, but not nothing either. Her name, or the word that became her name, was sail. I used it from the second day, and she responded without correction, which I took as acceptance. She was quiet in a way that didn't read as damage exactly, but as deep habit. Silence was her default and words were things she spent carefully. She followed me on my morning station walk from the third day, 2 steps behind and a little to my left, watching what I checked and how I checked it with an attention that felt systematic. Not curiosity. The attention of someone absorbing a process with the intention of running it independently later. By the end of the first week, she was checking the heating element readings herself when we passed each module. She would look at the panel, read the output, and either nod or stop. The one time she stopped, she pointed at an anomaly in the eastern module's pressure reading that I had logged 2 days earlier and was monitoring. I told her I had it on the schedule. She nodded and we moved on. I had not touched the chip. I found over the following weeks that she had some words of my language, not many, but but she could say yes and no and cold and more, and she understood significantly more than she produced. We built a working vocabulary together. Velthoran words she taught me by touching things and saying them. My words repeated back with the careful precision of someone who stores information exactly. She had a method. Velthoran word, pause, my word. She repeats mine once precisely, moves on. She never went back over a word she had already processed. She appeared to consider that job done once it was stored correctly. Within a month, we could hold a basic conversation. Within 2 months, we could argue about whether the eastern heating element needed a full replacement or just a new seal, which she won by showing me the corrosion pattern on the housing with a small, precise finger, and a look that left no room for further discussion. I ordered the replacement part. 3 weeks later it arrived and she installed the new seal herself while I held the lamp and handed over tools. The diagnostic read clean. She closed the housing panel and said, in my language, with the flat calm of someone reporting a completed task, it was the seal. I said I knew that now. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile but something. The chip stayed on the kitchen shelf. I had moved it from the common room table in the second week. It felt less conspicuous there than sitting in the middle of a social space, and Sale watched me move it and said nothing. She looked at it sometimes when she passed. She never asked me to open it. I understood this as an instruction, though not one delivered in words. The chip would open when it was supposed to open. She knew that and had accepted it, and she wanted me to accept it too. I did. I thought about her often in those early months, where she had come from, who had placed her and why, whether someone was looking and what kind of someone that would be. The diplomatic seal was what stayed with me. Not commercial, not civilian, not even standard compact administrative. Whoever had sealed that chip had genuine authority. I filed my best guess and left it there. She was here. She was safe. The rest would come when the chip was ready. The cold season arrived in the 4th week, and brought what cold seasons on Ketharavel always brought. A pressure drop in the eastern module cluster that took me 2 days to isolate and repair. The agronomists retreating completely into their building with their data sets and their arguments, and a particular silence over the station that was different from the ordinary quiet, thicker, more settled, the kind of silence that makes every sound inside it matter more. Sale heard that silence on the first morning of it and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the frost on the access road, and she said a word in Velthoran I hadn't learned yet. I asked what it meant. She thought before she answered. She always thought before she spoke, which I had already come to rely on, because it meant what she said was what she meant. And then she said, in my language, when everything goes still and you can hear the next thing coming. I said that was a useful word to have. She said her people used it for the moment before a decision too. Not the decision itself. The moment when the conditions have arranged themselves into the shape a decision requires, and you can feel it waiting. I said, I understand the difference. She said, I thought you might. I learned the word. I used it once or twice over the following weeks when I saw it was accurate, and each time I did she looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully classify, not surprise, not approval, something between the two, as though she was recalibrating an assumption she had made without announcing it. I understood, eventually, that it meant she had not expected me to retain it. She had taught it the way she taught everything, because it was accurate and available. But she had not assumed it would be kept. I tried to keep things. It seemed important. The cold season was long that year. The heating held with maintenance. The eastern cluster stayed pressurized. The agronomists surfaced twice for supply pickups and retreated again, and the 9 of us settled into the rhythms that fringe stations generate when everyone has enough work and no reason to bother each other. Sale moved into those rhythms without friction. She had an aptitude for systems, atmospheric controls, the Module 2 hydroponics monitoring, the maintenance schedule that went beyond ordinary aptitude. She could read a diagnostic output and locate the anomaly before I finished explaining what she was looking at. And she did it without performance, without wanting credit for it, which told me it wasn't a skill recently acquired, but one she had been using for some time in some other context. I mentioned this one evening over dinner. She said, without looking up from her food, that her mother had believed in thoroughness. It was the first time she had mentioned her mother. I didn't press. I said thoroughness was a useful quality in maintenance work. She agreed, and we moved on to whether the Module 2 grow lights needed recalibration before the spring planting cycle. I thought about that word mother for several days. The way she had said it, with the weight of a present tense that had become complicated by circumstances she wasn't going to explain yet. I decided, as I had decided about the chip, that it wasn't mine to push on. She would tell me what she needed me to know when she needed me to know it. Winter gave way to the early thaw, and the thaw to the short bright season that passed for spring on Catharuval, and Sale grew. Velthoran children move through their early years at a different pace than human children, slower in some ways, faster in others, but the growth was perceptible in the way that something growing in good conditions grows. She was eating better. She slept without the vigilance she'd had in those first weeks, when I'd heard her get up twice a night to check the corridor, standing in the doorway of her room listening to the station settle before going back to bed. By the third month she slept through. I only knew the night check habit had stopped because I stopped hearing it, the way you notice when a sound you've grown used to is gone. She had begun, without announcement, to claim small territories in the station as her own. A corner of the kitchen where she kept her personal tools, and the seed samples she'd started from the Module 2 overflow stock. A specific bench in the common room she occupied in the evenings with her maintenance notes. A spot on the eastern wall of Module 2 where she marked the grow light recalibration dates in her compressed Velthoran script. The marks were useful to me. I could read them well enough by the second year, and she knew that, which was why she put them on the wall rather than only in the system log where they would have been equally accurate but visible only on a screen. I ordered her proper clothing through the supply manifest, work clothes and cold weather layers, practical items, sized for her rather than me. She wore them with the same equanimity she brought to everything else. The transit garment went into the storage cabinet in her room. I saw it once during a quarterly room check, folded exactly as it had come, precise creases, stored as though it might be needed again rather than left as something outgrown. I let it be. By summer she was running half my station walk independently and logging her own maintenance notes in both languages. Velthoran first, my language in parallel, added for anyone else who needed to read them. The agronomists complained about the dual language entries exactly once. I explained that the translator was more thorough than I was, and that if they had objections, they were welcome to run their own module inspections. They did not raise the subject again. I turned 54 that summer. Sale found out from the station manifest. I hadn't mentioned it. Birthdays on fringe stations weren't events that got much attention, and I had stopped marking mine with any particular ceremony about 10 years back. She found the date anyway and made breakfast without telling me why. A more elaborate breakfast than usual, with a particular grain preparation that was close enough to the warm porridge I had grown up eating on the colony where I'd come from. The exact ratio of grain to water to the dried seed clusters she had sourced from the Module 2 overflow, which had no business being that similar to something from my childhood. That I sat down in front of it and felt, briefly and without warning, very far from anywhere, not in a bad way, in the way of someone who has traveled a long distance and suddenly realizes, looking at a table in front of them, that something about where they ended up was not accidental. She sat across from me and watched me eat it and said, I asked Porthen how it was done. Porthen was the station cook, a quiet man from the outer rim settlements who had been on Catharuval longer than anyone and who had, apparently, considerably more culinary range than he usually deployed on our behalf. I told her it was very good. She said, I know. I asked him to show me twice to be certain. I said I was glad she was thorough. She said, I know that too. We ate in the kind of quiet that had taken most of a year to arrive at, and that I had discovered was one of the things I valued most about the station. A quiet that didn't need filling. That was simply two people who understood each other's rhythms occupying the same space, without either of them having to perform the occupation. By autumn of that first year, she had also quietly taken over a portion of what had been my administrative logging work, not because I had asked, but because she had identified that I was consistently behind on it, and that the backlog was creating friction with the compact supply requisition system. She told me this the way she told me most things, as an accurate description of the present, and proposed that she handle the routine entries since she was faster and more precise. I said I had no objection. She began the following morning and reduced the backlog to 0 within a week. She filed her entries under my credential because she did not have one of her own, which was a gap in the administrative record I had been aware of since her arrival, and had not known how to address without triggering the reporting question I still wasn't ready to trigger. In her third year, I filed a dependent care declaration with the compact fringe station administrative office under the resettlement support provisions. It was not the cleanest fit for the situation, which did not fit any standard category neatly, but it was the provision closest to accurate, and it gave Sale a formal administrative status on the station's record. She read the filing when it came back confirmed, read it carefully, and then looked at me and said, "You filed this 3 years after you should have." I said I hadn't known the right mechanism until I had read the full framework twice. She said, "I know. That is why I filed it myself and put your credential on it." I looked at her. She said, "I found the correct provision in the second year. I waited to see if you would find it too." I said, "And when you concluded I wouldn't?" She said, "I filed it." I said, "You could have told me." She said, "You needed to find it yourself. The finding mattered." I thought about this, then I said, "Did I?" She said, "No, I was wrong about that. I should have told you in the second year. I am telling you now." It was the first time I could recall her admitting to a misjudgment in so many words. She said it the same way she said everything else, without performance, without deflection. And then she moved on to the module inspection schedule for the following week as though nothing particularly significant had happened. I thought it was one of the more significant things that had happened in 3 years. I kept that assessment to myself. The chip stayed on the kitchen shelf. I had long since stopped consciously noticing it in the way you stop noticing a weight you've learned to carry because it has become simply part of the total. Sale never asked me to open it. I never told her I would when the time came. We understood each other about it without having the conversation, the way we understood each other about most things. In the autumn of her second year at the station, she asked me one evening, while we were reviewing the winter maintenance schedule together, what the word was in my language for what a person was to a child they raised but didn't produce. I set down the schedule. I said there are a few words. The most common ones are foster parent guardian. The specific one for a man is foster father. She considered this. She said, "What is the word that means the thing more than the title?" I said I wasn't sure I understood the distinction. She said, "A title is what you call the role. The thing more than the title is what the role becomes when someone does it correctly over time, not the designation, the function, and the weight of it." I thought about that for a moment, then I said, "Father." She said the word back in my language, carefully, "father," and then said a word in Velthoran I hadn't heard before. It had the soft middle consonant but in a longer configuration, with a slight emphasis at the back that gave it different weight than the possessive. She told me it was the equivalent, not the biological term. The earned one, the word used when the function had been performed and recognized, not assumed. I said, "I know which one you mean." She said, "I thought you might." She went back to the maintenance schedule. I went back to the maintenance schedule. The heating element in the wall ticked and settled, and the cold season silence held over the station, and neither of us said anything else, because nothing else needed to be said. It wasn't a smooth 4 years. Not rough in any dramatic way, no crises, nothing that required more than we had between us. But 4 years with a child on a fringe station is 4 years of small daily emergencies and accumulated learning and things you get wrong and correct, and the slow recalibration that happens in both directions when two people are responsible for each other. I was too quiet sometimes when she needed words, and I pushed too hard on systems and schedules when what she needed was for someone to sit still. And I made assumptions about what she could handle on her own that turned out to be both too low and occasionally too high in ways I had to recalibrate over time. She corrected me when I was wrong. Not loudly, not with anger, but with the precise Velthoran directness I had come to understand was not bluntness but honesty, and which I had come to trust the way I trusted a well-calibrated instrument, because it gave me accurate readings. I learned to say when I didn't know something. This was harder than it sounds. 30 years as a groundskeeper on resettlement stations had built in me a working habit of proceeding confidently, because confidence was what stations needed from the person responsible for keeping them functional. Sale found this habit within the first 6 months and began systematically dismantling it by asking questions I couldn't answer and waiting patiently while I found the answers. "I don't know" was, she told me once, a more useful phrase than "I'll handle it," because "I'll handle it" was a promise about the future, and "I don't know" was an accurate description of the present. And accurate descriptions of the present were the only foundation you could build anything reliable on. She was approximately 8 years old when she told me this. Approximately, because I still didn't know her exact age. She had never told me and I had not asked, it having seemed less important than everything else. By her 10th year she was running the Module 2 hydroponics cycle independently and had begun teaching Torv, the junior station assistant who had arrived in our 2nd year together, how to read the atmospheric diagnostic outputs. She taught the way she learned, methodically, without impatience, circling back to cover anything that hadn't landed on the first pass, checking comprehension by asking him to demonstrate rather than recite. Torv told me once with genuine feeling that she was the most effective instructor he had encountered across 3 postings. I said I was not surprised. He said she was also slightly terrifying. I said that was accurate and that he should not let it put him off, because the terrifying part and the effective part came from the same place. He said, "What place is that?" I said, "She means what she says and she notices everything." He thought about it. He said, "That's the whole list, isn't it?" I said it was. The cold season of her 4th year at the station began the same as the others, the frost on the access road, the silence settling in over the fields, the agronomists retreating, the particular weight in the air that Sale had a word for. We had by then established rhythms so settled that the cold season required almost no adjustment beyond what we learned each year and applied to the next. Module 4 had a new seal. Module 2's atmospheric processor had been upgraded in the spring. The Eastern Module cluster was running cleaner than it had in my first years on the station, which I attributed without reservation to Sale's systematic approach to the maintenance log and her insistence on addressing small anomalies before they became large ones. I had, without entirely meaning to, become a better groundskeeper than I had been when she arrived. She had systematized processes I'd been running on instinct for years, and explaining things aloud in the course of teaching her, and then Torv had forced me to examine what I actually knew versus what I merely did out of habit. The difference between those two things turned out to be substantial. The courier arrived on a Tuesday in the 2nd month of that cold season. Velthoran, which I noted before he was out of the transport. Compact diplomatic credentials on a lanyard over a travel coat. A reader panel and nothing else. He walked toward the station entrance with the economy of movement of someone who has traveled a long distance and considers the travel incidental to the purpose. Not young. Deep slate silver skin, the shade that comes with Velthoran middle age, and eyes that moved over the station exterior in a single systematic pass that reminded me, uncomfortably, of someone I knew. I met him at the door. I said we didn't get many diplomatic couriers out here. He said, "Groundskeeper Row." I said that was me. He said he had a message regarding the data chip that had been left in my care approximately 4 standard years ago. He asked if I still had it. I said I did. He said, "And the child?" I said the child was in Module 2, adjusting the grow light calibration. Something shifted in his face. Controlled, he was a diplomat trained against visible reactions but real if you were watching. He said, "She is well." I said she was very well and had strong opinions about hydroponic cycle timing that she had communicated to me at length over the previous 3 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The sealed chip can now be opened. The seal was designed to release at 4 years standard. It requires your biometric to authenticate, not the child's." I said I'd figured it was something like that. He said, "You never tried to open it before." I said no. He said, "May I ask why?" I said, "Because whoever sealed it had a reason for the 4-year window. That reason wasn't mine to override." He looked at me for a moment and said nothing. Then he said, "I will need to be present when you open it." I went to the kitchen and got the chip from the shelf between the condiment rack and the tool organizer and pressed my thumb to the biored surface on the case. The seal released with a small, precise click that was quieter than I expected. The chip contained a message, text only. I read it standing at the kitchen counter while the courier stood in the doorway. It was not long. It said, "The child's name was Velsale Tho Keith, 4th-born daughter of the sovereign line, which by succession convention made her the daughter least likely to be sought, least likely to be guarded, and most likely to survive what was coming when the message was composed." The placement was deliberate. It was not abandonment. She needed me to understand that. She had placed a child and she understood what it would look like, and she needed me to know it looked wrong because it had to look wrong, not because it was. The placement was the only way to guarantee the child's safety during a succession crisis that could not be resolved quickly and could not be survived in the open. The groundskeeper at Ketharuval Agricultural Station had been selected on the basis of a detailed assessment, concluding he was the kind of person who would keep a child safe without asking what he would receive in return. The 4-year seal was the period required to resolve the succession crisis. If the chip was being opened, the crisis was resolved. If I was reading the message, she had survived, and I had kept the child safe, and 4 years of worry had been carried toward an answer that was, apparently, yes. She intended to discharge what she owed in person. She would arrive within the week following the courier. It was signed with a name I did not read aloud. I set the chip down on the counter. The courier said, "The matter is concluded on our end. The child's status and origin will be registered with the compact administrative record as of today. There will be no complications for you or the station. The placement was conducted under diplomatic instrument, and the instrument is intact." I said, "I understand." He said, "Someone will arrive within the week." He paused and added, with the precision of someone delivering an exact message, "She wished me to tell you that she is aware of the interval. She is aware of what 4 years means." I said, "All right." After he left, I stood in the kitchen for a while and let the quiet settle back in around me. The chip sat on the counter where I had put it down, the case open now, the seal gone. I looked at it and thought about the shelf between the condiment rack and the tool organizer where it had sat for 4 years, unobtrusive, unremarkable, present in the background of every meal and every maintenance review and every evening in the kitchen. I thought about Sale looking at it sometimes when she passed and never asking me to open it, because she had already accepted its timeline the way she accepted most things, as a fact of the present, not a grievance about it. I thought about the assessment the message mentioned, someone deciding, on the basis of evidence I couldn't reconstruct, that I was the kind of person who would keep a child safe without asking what he would receive in return. I thought about whether they'd been right. I thought about Module 6 and the amber indicator light, and the cold room, and a small figure in the corner of a shelf with her knees pulled to her chest, and a sealed diplomatic chip held against her heart. I thought, yes, I think they were right, not because I'm particularly exceptional, but because a child was there, and the only question that mattered in that moment was the one I asked. Do you want to come get warm? I made dinner. I didn't tell Sale about the courier yet. Not because I was hiding it, because I had learned over 4 years that information given in the right sequence lands differently than information given all at once, and that she would need to understand the chip before she could absorb what came next. Those were 2 separate things requiring 2 separate moments. She wouldn't panic at either, but she would want the right order, and I knew her well enough by then to give it to her. I told her over dinner. I told her the chip had been opened and that I had read it, and that her full name was Vel Sale Tho Keith, if she wanted to use it. I told her the placement had been intentional and not abandonment. She listened without interrupting, hands flat on the table, very still in the way she was still when she was absorbing something fully, not resisting it, not cataloging it yet, just letting it arrive. When I finished, she said, "You knew there was a reason for the seal." I said I assumed there was. She said, "You waited 4 years." I said it wasn't my chip to open. She looked at me with the expression she used when she was registering something for the record, not agreement exactly, but accurate receipt, filed without comment, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Then she said, "She is coming." Not a question. She had moved ahead of the information to where it led. I said within the week. She was quiet. Long enough that I heard the atmospheric processor cycle in the wall and the distant sound of the cold season wind picking up over the fields. Then she said, "I have not spoken her language in 4 years. I still know it, but I have not used it." I said, "I know, you'll use it when you need to." She said, "Yes." She ate. I ate. After dinner she washed the dishes, her habit on alternating evenings, methodical as always, each item in order, dried and returned to its place, the cloth folded and hung square. I sat at the kitchen table and watched her and felt the ordinary weight of an ordinary evening that was, in less than a week, going to become something other than ordinary. When she finished, she put the cloth away and turned around and looked at me. She said, "The word I taught you. The earned one." I said, "I remember it." She said it again, in Velthoran, the soft middle consonant placing it correctly in the air between us. Then she said, "I want you to know that it is not conditional. On what comes next, I mean. It does not change because the circumstances change. That is what makes it the earned word rather than the title." I said, "I know." She said, "I wanted to say it plainly, because you once told me that accurate descriptions of the present are the only foundation you can build anything reliable on." I said, "I'm glad the lesson landed." The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Sale was not, by nature, a demonstrative person, but the thing she had that served the function, the small involuntary shift I had learned over 4 years to recognize as the most genuine expression she made. It meant something had satisfied a standard she had been holding without announcing it. She said good night and went to her room. I sat at the kitchen table a while longer in the cold season quiet and let everything settle. The week passed the way weeks on Ketharavel passed in winter. Maintenance to do, a hydroponic cycle to monitor, small daily problems solved and logged and moved past. Sale worked. I worked. We ate meals together, reviewed the schedule, argued mildly about whether the Module 4 atmospheric sensor needed replacement or recalibration. I said recalibration. She said replacement. She was right, as she usually was on questions of that kind. I ordered the part. She did not seem anxious about the coming arrival. She seemed, if anything, more focused than usual, applying the same systematic attention she gave a complex maintenance task to whatever internal preparation a person makes for something they have been waiting years to be ready for. I understood this. It was how she worked. The transport arrived on a Friday afternoon. Small, a courier-class vessel, nothing ceremonial in its construction. One pilot and one passenger, and the passenger came down the boarding ramp alone, in a travel coat the color of deep winter, and nothing about her announced anything except that she had traveled a long way and considered the travel incidental to where she was going. I would not have known who she was from the coat or the economy of her walk, except that I had read the message and knew the name, and more relevantly, I knew who she looked like. She was tall, skin the pale silver of Velthoran middle age, and dark hair worn close. Her eyes were the same luminous gray as Sail's, with the same quality of taking in a full inventory before committing to a response. She looked at the station, then at me, and in the moment before she spoke I could see her doing what the message described, assessing. I met her at the station entrance and said that Sail was in Module 2. She said, "Groundskeeper row." I said that was me. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, but that contained, I thought, the weight of 4 years of carrying something and arriving at the end of the carrying. Then she said, "The assessment said you were the kind of person who would keep a child safe without asking what you would receive in return. The assessment was correct." I said, "The assessment didn't account for the fact that she ended up teaching me more than I taught her. She would want me to be accurate about that." Something in her face shifted. Not softened, exactly. She was not a soft person, which explained something about where Sail had come from and why Sail was the way she was, but changed, in the way something changes when it recognizes a familiar quality in an unexpected location. She said, "That sounds like her." I said, "It is her, consistently." She said, "I know. I have been watching the station reports for 4 years." I said I hadn't known the station filed reports she had access to. She said, "It doesn't. I had access." I considered this. Then I said, "She's in Module 2. I'll take you over." She said, "I know where Module 2 is. I know the station layout. I have known it for 4 years." I said, "Then you know it's a 3-minute walk from here." She looked at me steadily. Then quietly she said, "Lead the way." We walked. She didn't speak, and neither did I. The cold season air was sharp and still over the fields, the ridgeline holding the low afternoon light along its edge, and the particular quality of the silence was the one Sail had a word for: everything still, the next thing present and waiting. I thought that was accurate. I thought Sail would agree it was accurate. I opened the Module 2 door, and the warm air and the living smell of the growing cycle came out to meet us, and Sail was at the far wall with her back to us, adjusting the grow light angle on the 3rd rack with both hands and the precise attention she gave everything. She said, without turning, "The recalibration is done. I've logged it in both languages. You don't need to check." Then she turned. She was still for a moment. The exact quality of stillness she'd had in the corner of Module 6 on the first day, not frozen, not frightened, but fully arrested. Every process paused while she took in what was in front of her and let it be real. Her eyes moved from her mother to me and back to her mother. Her mother said something in Velthoran, low and direct, not the formal register but something closer, the cadence that exists in a language when the speaker is no longer managing it but simply using it. I caught pieces. The name, Sail though Keith, and the word that meant she had not forgotten, and at the end of it the word that meant something belongs or is settled. Sail answered. Precise in Velthoran the way she was precise in my language, which is to say completely, and she spoke without hesitation, the 4 years of not using it having cost her nothing she couldn't recover immediately. I caught pieces. The station's name, a word I recognized as the Velthoran term for maintenance work, something that sounded like the word for thoroughness. She was giving her mother a description of the station the way she gave me descriptions of things she considered important, in the order that made structural sense, beginning with the evidence. At the end of what she said I caught the word, the earned one, the soft middle consonant, the longer configuration with the weight of the function in it. I saw something move through her mother's expression when she heard it, something that didn't get entirely suppressed, which told me it had landed the way Sale had intended it to land. Then she looked at me and switched languages without breaking the sentence's momentum, and she said, "This is Davin, he is the person who stayed." Her mother looked at me. I looked at my daughter. I thought, yes, that is accurate. That is the whole of it in 8 words, the function and the weight of it, exactly what she had told me the earned word meant. Not the designation, the thing more than the title. Outside, the cold season air was still over the fields and the frost was on the access road, and the ridgeline held the last of the afternoon light the way it always did at this time of year. A long, flat gold that didn't warm anything but made every edge visible. Inside Module 2, the grow lights ran at the angle Sale had calibrated, and the atmospheric processor held at the level she had set, and the station was doing what it always did, the small, unglamorous, necessary work of keeping things alive. I was the person who stayed. It turned out that was enough to be.